Okay. So just allowing ourselves to get in as comfortable a posture and position as you can be in right now at this time. And whether that's with your, at least for me, I'm okay, whether that's with the camera on or screen off, sitting down, lying down, standing, whatever's going to work for you in this moment. Sometimes I find it helpful maybe to raise and lower the shoulders, unclench the jaw, soften the belly. And then just a couple of natural breaths, just noticing what that's like, noticing what that feels like, maybe getting a sense of the mood or attitude of the mind right now. And then getting a sense of the contact point. So perhaps your bottom on a cushion or back against a chair, feet on the ground, noticing all of those things. Continuing to come back to the breath. And really getting a sense of the whole body sitting if you can, just maybe the expanding and contracting of the body, breathing almost like a balloon. Just sit and know you're sitting. And whether you're noticing warm or cool air at the nostrils, rise and fall at the chest or the belly, just noticing that and allowing it to be natural. And perhaps you're noticing sensations in the body, maybe some tingling in the body, some warmth or coolness. And whatever it is that you're attending to, really doing so with a gentleness, as much gentleness and kindness as you can muster in this moment. At some point, you'll probably notice the mind wander. The mind's job is to think, so it will happen. And then noticing that, just coming back again with the gentleness and kindness. And coming back is the moment of mindfulness. So coming back to the breath in the body or sensations in the body. Perhaps even sounds in the background, the sound of my voice. Sit and know you're sitting. May you be happy. May you be peaceful. May you be safe and protected. May you live with ease and well-being. And may you awaken and be free. May the merits of this practice benefit all beings and bring about peace. Thank you. Thank you all for your practice. So when I was thinking about halfway through, I realized I didn't pack a bell. That's what I didn't remember to do. So I'll have a little bit of time to share some reflections on mettā, Samadhi, everyday Samadhi, and should leave plenty of time for any comments and questions. I actually, one of my preferences is really to teach from that place of the question and response there. So I'll leave plenty of time for that. So I want to start off first actually with a little bit of the backstory of the mythology of the story of mettā, which often isn't, I mean, you may have heard it many times, but often it isn't pointed to very much. So it's said that the Buddha first taught mettā to a group of 500 monks who went into a particular and seemingly very congenial forest for this 3-month rainy season retreat. And it was a forest adjacent to a village of strong supporters, folks who had offered to build 500 huts for the monks to stay in during this rains retreat, and who were also happy to keep their bowls full, their alms bowls filled with food during the practice period. And so the monks moved in and they began practicing insight. And it's said at that time that the unseen beings, the forest devas who lived there, became fearful of the monks and felt quite put out when they saw that the monks weren't just visiting the forest for a day or two. And so these forest dwelling beings began to create these frightening sounds and sights, and said to emit some very distasteful odors, hoping that all this would make the monks leave what they considered to be their forest. And soon enough, the monks became quite terrified, which broke their samadhi, broke their concentration, and disrupted their mindfulness. And some even developed fever and pain and dizziness, it said, in conjunction with the fear that they were experiencing. And it all felt nearly next to impossible to continue practicing where they were. So they went to where the Buddha was staying and they told him the story, to which the Buddha responded, "My beloved monks, go back to exactly the same forest and practice your meditation there." The monks responded to the Buddha's words by pleading that they not be sent back to that forest, again saying it was impossible to practice. And the Buddha's response to this was, "Dear monks, because you went there to practice meditation without a weapon of protection, you have encouraged many distractions and difficulties. This time, however, I will give you a true weapon of protection." And it's said at that point that the Buddha offered them the mettā teaching and practice. And out of their great respect for the Buddha, the monks didn't dare to contradict his wishes. And so, armed with this mettā teaching and practice, they went back to the forest, and for a while continuing to experience these feelings of fear and anxiety. And while at the same time, they were now diligently and virtuously, it said, practicing mettā. And soon there were no more fearful sights and sounds. And where the devas had previously been really hostile towards them, their anger and resentment began to disappear when they began to feel the monks' mettā, it said. And in fact, feelings of respect, welcome, and even reverence began to be the devas' experience, along with this sense of being connected to them. And the inclination arose to provide this environment of safety, to protect the monks from particular dangers that might be lurking in the forest so that they could practice meditation peacefully. After recovering and strengthening and deepening their concentration and wholehearted presence through practicing metta. It's said that, of course, all 500 monks at some point began practicing insight again with metta as the foundation. And it's said because they were able to practice meditation calmly and peacefully, of course, they all became arahants, fully enlightened, because in a mythology, right, everyone lives happily ever after at the end. And so you may have heard this many times, and it's worth sharing because as the mythology goes, the monks used metta to develop this quiet and gathered mind and an open heart. So this samadhi that we often hear about is often defined as concentration or one-pointedness. And it is that. And I really like to define it as, and I experience it as, a gathered mind. Not just a one-pointed mind, but a mind that's free of distraction and gathered, naturally gathered. And there are a number of things that can set us up with being able to better gather the mind. Could be, some of the obvious, less social media, consumption of various tech, movies, that sort of thing. Learning to single task, I think, is actually an incredibly important one, rather than go to the multitasking overconsumption that we typically do. The single task, learning to savor, essentially. An example, so one of my favorite meditation practices has actually been quite helpful for me in some of the concentration or some of the jhana practices I do, is actually listening to music. So taking music and using it as this, as a focus practice. So that would look something like laying on the sofa or sitting in a chair and with headphones on and listening to a piece of music, one piece of music. So not drinking a cup of tea or journaling about it or having a conversation, anything else, but listening to music for music's sake, the single task. And while listening to this music, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 passes at a time, listening to it once just for the experience to see what emotions or feelings are evoked or how it feels in the body. But then on some of the other times, just actually you can choose almost an object of meditation. So you could take a voice or a horn. So it could be John Coltrane's horn. It could be Joni Mitchell's voice or whoever, or someone playing a guitar, and focus on that particular instrument throughout the song. Everything else begins to fade to the background, and that becomes the focus. That actually builds quite a bit of focus in the mind. It's an interesting one to play around with. Similarly, something like a single task is actually drinking a cup of tea. In New England, when I'm, we get the first snow or the 10th snow by the time it gets to February, and it's 10 degrees out, and I'm sitting at the window and I can't leave, and I'm just dreaming of getting to the airport and leaving, heading somewhere with sun and warmth. It's this single task where I'm getting a sense of the taste of the tea, the smell of the tea, the temperature and warmth on the hand, the texture of the cup itself. All of those are these single tasks that actually influence the mind, that begin to orient the mind towards slowing down and taking focus. Walking, hiking in the natural world, of course, is one that we all probably have done at some point in time. Working with the elements, the 4 elements in meditation, is another one of those things. And some of the, and classically, of course, developing the paramis. So oftentimes what I do oftentimes is working in concentration practices or some of the jhana practices or that thing. And people always ask, well, what sort of things can I do to precondition or before coming on retreat, that sort of thing. And I often say, so one of the things I do at the beginning of the year is I just start on the paramis all over again. I take them one by one over the course of a month and work with them as best I can, because actually developing the paramis is a beautiful and wonderful way to begin to settle the mind a bit. In various practices, keeping the 5 precepts close at heart, the 5 remembrances. And these are all things that really classically are known to keep us from constantly being agitated in the mind, right? They align with our deepest intentions and aspirations. And I believe that mettā itself is really this ongoing way that can be truly skillful in establishing this flow of the heart, a contentedness that you can actually rely on. So I have a little, a short story. I should tell a little bit of a short story. So a few years ago, I had this opportunity to be involved in this recording of what they build as a silent meditation album. An old school record that's meant to be played on a record player, right? So there's a sticker on the cover of the album that was to read, "This record contains 2 sides of complete silence. The album does not require a record player to be fully enjoyed. Technically, it doesn't even require a record. The perfect gift for someone who wants nothing." So, and it actually went through the whole process of recruiting people to record meditations for this silent meditation album and the whole thing. And really, the record was this homage to the composer, John Cage, experimental composer, John Cage. So he had this famous record called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where John Cage sits at a piano and he plays nothing. And as you listen, you begin to realize that even though the piano is quiet, the room isn't quiet. The whole point of the piece being to remind you of how much ambient noise there is all around you all the time. And the same principle applies to meditation. We don't really notice the ambient noise in our mind until we try to make it be still, try to make it be quiet, so that we can be with the breath and the body and sensations, or mettā practice. And you soon realize that the mind can be this random story maker or thought generator, and all manner of feelings, emotions, etc., arise in the practice if they aren't already present. And just as it did for the monks, mettā at times serves as a purification practice before it actually becomes this flow of the heart. And there, of course, it's a number of things that can support us in developing this ongoing habit of the open heart of mettā. And one of those being service and generosity. So oftentimes when a number of the practices came west or were presented here in the West, one of the things that often didn't come, or that I don't see as often as I see in practicing in Asia or with some of the heritage Buddhists who see, is actually just service. It's like using service as a way to begin to settle body, heart, and mind. It's generosity. And just as in our own meditation practice, there has to be a pause and a noticing and some reflection on what we're actually seeing and what we're actually doing, and service actually allows that. There's this really interesting study called the Good Samaritan study. And in the Good Samaritan study, it was done at Princeton. These seminary students were given this practice sermon, of which half of them were assigned to the story of the Good Samaritan, and the other half were assigned some other random Bible story. And so the students were supposed to go to another building to give the sermon and be evaluated on it. But on their way to the other building, they passed a person in a doorway who was moaning in distress. And so the real question for the study was actually whether the seminary students were going to stop for help. And the research showed that it depended on how much time they thought they had before they had to give their sermon. If the students believed that they would be late, they didn't stop to help, even though the sermon that they were about to preach was about being the Good Samaritan. And I actually find this to be quite revealing and powerful. It's next to impossible to act out of love, kindness, benevolence, goodwill, if you will, if we turn away from, if we don't take the time to, are not in the body, not feeling the heart, in fact, living actually a distance from the naturally appropriate responses of mettā and karuna. With the, could be the squeeze of conceptual time, I, me, mine that cut us off from the heart again and again and again. It's a poem from Hafiz. Once a man came to me and spoke for hours about his great visions of God that he felt he was having. He asked me for confirmation, saying, "Are these wondrous dreams true?" And I replied, "How many goats do you have?" He looked surprised and said, "I'm speaking of sublime visions, and you asked me about goats?" And I spoke again, saying, "Yes, brother, how many goats do you have? How many do you have?" "Well, I have 62. "And what of your wife? And how many rose bushes in your garden? How many children? Are your parents still alive? Do you feed the birds in the winter?" And to all he answered. And then I said, "You asked me if I thought your visions were true. I would say that they were, if they make you become more human, more open, more kind to every creature and plant that you know." So this mettā is often, and I mentioned it in the story, thought of as this weapon of protection. And I actually like to really think of it as, rather than thinking of it as a weapon of protection, as this disarming power. So the disarming power of mettā, and you could put karuna or compassion in there, is this onward leading interplay of appropriate responses. And this great medicine, this great medicine of heart and awareness, has the capacity to nurture our inner life really like nothing else, revealing, as Hafiz said, more of our humanity, more of our kindness, as we begin to deepen into the non-self nature of interbeing, leading to what I call the only true revolution, and what the Buddha described as the sure heart's release, where he says, "The purpose of my teaching of the holy life of the Dhamma is not for gaining merit, nor good deeds, nor rapture, nor concentration, but for the sure heart's release. This and this alone is the reason for the teachings." And that is, it's not the Dhammapada. I forget that I actually didn't mark the reference for that, but rest assured, it is not a fake Buddha quote, which most of what we often hear are actually fake Buddha quotes. This is not a fake Buddha quote. So again, is really pointing out again that the purpose for all of the practices that we do, and these are practices of integrity, practices of non-harming, of benevolence, of goodwill, compassion, and steadiness in mind, and the insight and understanding that arises from them. And it's all to bring about the arising of the sure heart's release, this unshakable deliverance of mind, they say. So this other story in service, something that I witnessed as a child that I've often reflected on in my grandfather's, my favorite story from my grandfather, who was a deacon at a church. So, and he would give this ministry, this report of a ministry when we would go on Sundays. And it was a ministry of what they called at that time, the sick and the shut in. And he would start off, "Our brothers and sisters are shut in, but will not be shut out of our hearts." So the program that he led, which is reminiscent and why I actually thought of it, was called the Good Samaritan Project. And so it served those who were sick or who could no longer come to church because they were now aging, living in senior homes. Some were mourning. And I knew many of the folks that were there. They'd been the postal workers in our neighborhood, school teachers around, and they're folks that hadn't been to church, many of them for years. And this is the early 70s. So a number of the men had been in Vietnam and were now home or didn't come home or were there. And so my grandfather and this church team would bring all of these people food, and they would clean houses, they'd maintain yards, and they would sing to them. I remember going to the house and they would sit on the porch and they would be singing to these people and talking to them, so that they always remained a part of the community. And at this particular church service, when they would be doing this, their names and photos were pasted on these little cards that were passed around. And people would offer words of encouragement and compassion and love. And so all of the hands of people in church would be on the card or connected to one of the cards, and the hands on the back of the shoulder of someone else, until everybody in the church was actually connected in this symbolic harnessing of generosity and kindness. And so my grandfather always said that his role in this particular ministry was to know them in mind and embrace them by heart. So years after my grandfather died, I received his church notes, and they were given to me because they had some of my handwriting in them from that time, my 8-year-old handwriting. And he used to give this to me to stop me from asking questions about church, like why I needed to come and do this, and who was this guy that on the cross at the front of the room, and just all of these things that as a kid in my mind were horrific. And my grandfather, I don't think, wanted to answer those questions. And so he would give me a little journal to write in, and I'd ask him questions, and sometimes he'd ask me questions. So from this little journal page, the question itself is actually cut off, but there's a faded answer in my handwriting and then his. And he says, "One day I will surely die, and so will you. And I'll die having known a good life of service. And yet I could have loved more, and I could have loved others more. And if I did, I'd let that love express itself even more as a concern for my neighbors, my friends, and everybody I come in touch with, whether in person, over the phone, or in my letters to the prisoners." So he did as part of the church work. They were working with incarcerated folks as well. "I would let that love permeate me, overcome me, and overwhelm me, and then direct me. I would let that love permeate me, overcome me, overwhelm me, and then direct me." Which actually, now looking back, is quite similar to the Metta Sutta. So it is with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness. One should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. So one thing to know about this wayfarer's journey that we are all on, if we're in this practice and find a place for the Dhamma, one thing that we may want to remember and recall often is that for the practice to unfold, we must learn to trust the power of the heart and awareness to awaken us through any and all circumstances. And that's what ends up deepening us. If we actually stay connected to breath and body and heart and mind, we can open to a spaciousness and this enlarged sense of being, which untangles us from that small sense of self, even if just for a moment. And at that point invites us and allows us this steady, gathered mind, this mind that's inclined towards quiet, and this mind that's inclined towards a heart that flows. And when we can meet the painful parts of our being, and then we have room for that small sense of self and room to hold others truly at heart, breathing and opening to sorrow, grief, regret, personal history, whatever it is. We're no longer protecting against loss. We're open to forgiveness. When the practice works on us on that level, it works through what the poet Joy Harjo has a poem, or within a poem, called a conflict resolution for holy beings. Conflict resolution for holy beings, which is really sort of, that's how I frame metta, how I frame metta practice, conflict resolution for holy beings. It leads us to the sure heart's release. The sure heart's release certainly is born of this gathered mind, an open heart, and may in fact reside. This is what I call the true revolution. It's a possibility of that. So mettā is a thread that connects our practice to social transformation. And that transformation isn't dependent on anyone else. We have the power and the capacity to change the direction of our mind every single day. And it begins with us. And the engine is our intention and wholehearted presence. We can hear Dharma talk after Dharma talk. You could hear anybody talk about anything. You could go on Dharma feed and listen to everything there, and it will do absolutely nothing if the engine of intention and wholehearted presence aren't there. The great strength of loving kindness, friendliness, and goodwill is vulnerability. It's a type of vulnerability that sets the compass of the heart in the direction of belonging and connection. And I like that analogy of lighting a pilot light to a heater. At some point, it's that warmth that actually gets brought to the room at that point. That warmth at some point begins to quiet the mind, and that warmth is what opens the heart, making the way for a stability that leads to contentment, a stability that leads to a deeper happiness that we can actually count on. All of that sets the stage for, one that's interested in doing jhana practice or deeper states of concentration practice. All of that sets the stage for that. We can just sit down and I say that just from my own experience, right? I just flew across country. My mind is all over the place. My body feels like it's still in New England. The rest of me is here. The house is being remodeled. There's sanding floors. My anxious mind is convinced that just me sitting here giving the talk right now, I'm breathing the fumes from the sanding that they were doing and like present with you, and all of that stuff is going on as well. So what's been most helpful for me for these last 15 years, it's been mostly my main practice, is actually taking on mettā as a full-blown daily practice. And that doesn't necessarily mean formally on the cushion, but just in and out throughout the day. And I think the first thing that did it from me, and it was my least favorite practice for the first several years, whether I went on meditation retreats at IMS or Spirit Rock or anywhere else, when it came time to do mettā in the afternoon, and I always knew exactly when it was. It's like we've had lunch, there's been a movement program, and then sometime around 2:30, 3:30, there's mettā. And that's when I would go for a hike. It was like, I'm not doing this. In my mind, it was syrupy, it was sappy. I was convinced, particularly when I would be at Spirit Rock, that this was like something that was created somewhere between 68 and 72, really well-meaning hippies that had nothing to do with the Buddha's Dharma. I was really convinced that it was just this made-up practice. Turns out it's what I most needed, right? Aversive personality, a little prickly and particular. And noticing that and living in San Francisco every day and going to work on a train and headed down on the train. And at some point I realized, after doing many retreats, that how painful it was for me to get from point A to point B, for me to get to my house, to get to the job, because all along the way, I began to notice and count and see in glaring detail just the constant judgment of myself and the constant judgment of others, the projection of who I thought they were all along the way, constantly. And the mettā practice is what I use to be able to actually cut through that. It's one of those things. So the person who introduced me who made me aware of Insight in San Diego and the young and the deathless, Ruben. I met him. The reason I met him at the Forest Refuge is because for the first few weeks, never told him this story, right? I'm telling you guys something I actually haven't even told him. So for the first few weeks, I had a projection of who I thought he was. I had a story. And as long as I have a story and that sort of projection and I'm deep in retreat, it really kind of throws the practice off. And I'm interested in my practice deepening, and I'm interested in clearing out all of the gunk. And so I began to actually offer mettā to him, say mettā to him. And then I decided at some point to actually meet him, and on and on and on, and realized that it's just a story in my head, just a story. And so mettā has done that time and time and time again for me. The neutral person, or the neutral category in mettā, right? There are these categories. Has typically been my favorite category to work with. I spend a lot of time taking car service and Uber back and forth to airports and to retreat centers and that thing. And that's an opportunity for me to connect with someone that I've never met before. It typically starts with getting in a car with them. And oftentimes around here, right, there are folks that are fairly newly immigrated, or a number of folks from countries that are primarily Buddhist countries. And it's an opportunity for me to ask them about their idea and knowledge and practice, and how they understood Buddhism. And it has led to some incredible conversations. It's led to a few people coming and having lunch at the house and having tea, and horrifying my daughters that I'm bringing strangers in, and they're wondering why the Uber guy's car is parked in the driveway and he's in the house having tea. They found it a little odd. But it has, over the years, has become a way to make my world smaller, and really open my heart and open my eyes, right? I'm discerning. I'm not just letting everyone in always, but it is and it is something that I have noticed. And all of that has had a direct impact on my practice, direct impact on me sitting down on the cushion and what happens in the mind at that time, right? You begin to incline the mind over and over again, gladdening the mind, right? You begin to dig those grooves in the same way that we have that everyone has with our negativity bias, right? It's what we do. We think the worst, and we plan and build the future on essentially the worst, and it actually counters quite a bit of that. So I will I have caffeine late. I could go all night, but I think I actually want to hear from you all. So I'm curious if there are any questions, comments, concerned about my level of caffeine, or anything you'd like to mention. And happy to hear. I mean, if you prefer to put it in the chat, then maybe someone could see it and read it. I don't know if I'm technologically competent to do the chat with my iPad, but I do see Mark, who is now vertical. You see Mark.
Hi, Devin.
Hello.
Well, you've shared a lot of really wonderful ideas about everyday samadhi and trying to keep that present. And yet, it's such a difficult thing to do, whether it's drinking tea or appreciating the smells as you walk down the street, or hearing bird sounds. I'm just wondering if you have any tips to try to help integrate that more. It's just the process of continually forgetting, right?
Yes.
To bring that to mind.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things I forget every day. As I said, coming here, just my mind got very particular, as I said, about that my new space. I don't have what I'm used to. I don't have my iMac in front of me. The camera on my iPad is off to the side. There are a million things that are pulling me and distracting me, and and can completely and totally forget to savor, to do a single task, to have gratitude, to my mettā phrases. So it's really just one thing, taking one of those things on. Oftentimes, and I kid you not, I have them. I will have them at times written in ink on my hand. I will have a Post-it note in my pocket. They're in my car above the steering wheel. Little things like that. I throw the kitchen sink in it, any and everything I can do. I mean, I know that just the painful, the pain that I've had from my own self-judgment, critical mind, perfectionism, and all of those things get going. It's incredibly painful. And I want to be able to see through that and work through that. So I throw the kitchen sink at it little by little. The thing that's been helpful for me, and I said with where I start with music, because there's an element of me actually being able to relax into that, and I can go from there. I can find 5 or 10 minutes for me to lay on the bed, lay on the sofa, sit in a chair, pop some headphones on, and listen to one song. Even if I don't track it and use it directly as a meditation as an object of meditation, it's actually 5 minutes settling my body, relaxing my nervous system. That goes a long way, and whatever it is that's going to happen after that, it happens. So all of these things that may help to relax help. No, the relaxation isn't going to isn't a part of the liberative teachings of the Buddha, right? The liberative teachings of the Buddha didn't say put on Bob Dylan. That's not, you're not going to find it in there. But it's something that's helpful. It's something that's supportive. So little by little, typically taking a walk is one, and the thing that I enjoy, that I like about these, or that I find important about all of, is that I don't need to remember to bring the Dharma to it or to bring a metta phrase to it. I just, as long as my body's there, then at some point I begin to feel it. Even if I walk down the street and, I'm noticing on my, on the new street, the trees or bushes or particular flowers or something that's going on in somebody's garden, even if I notice that in the middle of the block, before I get to that place and after I get to that place, I'm thinking about, wow, this tax bill is this is just nuts. This is crazy. I'm Dharma. I can't do this. I need to find, like, all of that's happening too. But in the middle of that, there's the stopping and the knowing. That is a beautiful shade of red. The bougainvillea in the house is absolutely good. Like, all of those things are there, right? That's the moment of mindfulness. And we think that we need to have like tons and tons of it. We just need to have that one. The proximate cause of the moment of mindfulness is another moment of mindfulness. It's a possibility that it'll happen again. Mm. And we're oftentimes focusing on the forgetting, but really in that hour of all the forgetting, all the stories and on and on and on, when there is that remembering, that noticing this beautiful particular shade of something, or the smell is the smell of something, there's jasmine or whatever it is that's there, noticing and savoring that for a moment, that moment of mindfulness is worth those 58 minutes completely being lost in thought or anything else. So the strength of that moment is equal to that. So that's one to keep in mind.
Great, thanks. I will.
And I know it's not easy. That I should actually preface the entire thing by saying, this sounds great. None of it's easy. That would have been helpful. Thank you, Mark. Mm-hmm. Anybody else have a comment or question? Seen how this has worked in their own life and practice, or not worked? I think there was something in the chat. Oh no, it was a link for Donna. Someone must have heard my IRS comment and decided they would contribute. You could just send it directly to Utah, I think, IRS. I see a hand.
Hi,
Alan. And Alan. Hi, Alan. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Devin. This is great. This is the first time I've heard you speak. And the metta practice for me is the Metta Sutta. Some years ago, I memorized it. I repeated as much as possible during the day, certainly when I'm sitting down. And the sense of the boundless radiating. It's even for me. It helps me more than identify individuals, but identify the neighborhood, the houses near me, the people I see, and spread it out. So I really like the fact that you quoted the Mettā Sutta, and the radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, upwards and unbounded, free from hatred and in will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, or that's kind of means whenever we're awake. This is said to be the sublime abiding. Wow, what is that? So that's like gripping, you know, that really turns me on. And again, like you, I mean, this is not always. This is, you know, one of my better parts of the day when I'm this way and I'm not some other way that's all goofy, you know. So it's the Mettā Sutta is key for me.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you very much for saying that. So part of what even sparks any of this for me is, so my first trip to India, and which wasn't to practice. I wasn't a speaker. I was like a college kid backpacking. I was there to party. They had really cheap alcohol. So I was there on a beach in Goa. But the family, so I stayed at a guest house, and the family that I was staying with, their entire practice was there was a chanting of the Mettā Sutta. That was it. And and we oftentimes will discount that here. Memorizing something like the Mettā Sutta or the Anapanasati. So that's one. The Mettā Sutta today, I didn't read it because I no longer have it memorized. But you give me a week on retreat, it all comes back up. And at times, just being able to chant, to say that, to recite that, and to reflect on what some of that means is a practice in and of itself. And it's similar that, you know, and taking some of those things, that's I do similarly with the Anapanasati. I heard these words of the Buddha one time when he was staying at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Nathapindika's Park with many well-known and accomplished disciples. There was the Venerable Sariputra, the Venerable Moggallana, and so on, right? You commit them to memory, and it is, again, the intention and aspiration is underneath the words, right? So something when we're saying like the phrases in mettā, it's what we're doing is we're pointing at, as Alan said, the neighborhood, or it could be individuals or groups of people or beings. We're pointing at them through the phrases, and we're to reach underneath the phrases. It is the intention and the aspiration. In the same way that we are notice the breath or follow the breath, that's what we're doing with the phrases. That's what we're doing with the radiating. We're breathing in and we're breathing it out. What Alan was doing with the Mettā Sutta, it's the same way. That is breathing it in and breathing it out. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Oh, and if you ever get a chance, I don't can remember this. There is a beautiful chanting of the Mettā Sutta on Dharma Seed. There was a wonderful Sri Lankan teacher named Dhammaruwan, 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 and he chants the Mettā Sutta, and you'll want to look for the one that is, I want to say, I believe it's October 26th, 2013, and it starts at 6 minutes and 41 seconds. I only know because I've heard it a million times. It is just profoundly beautiful. He chants it in Pali. It's not in English, but it's beautiful just to hear it in the vernacular of the time. And what I like about that in particular is that the Sri Lankans, the older chanting that they did at one time is actually quite melodic. There's this beautiful melody to it. So it's my what I listen to put myself to sleep at night. It's the last thing I hear at night and the first thing I hear in the morning. And I see Kason.
Yeah, hi. I appreciated your reminder about music, and I've followed your instruction before to listen to a piece of music and focus on a single instrument, and I've really loved that. It's a great object for concentration, but also I've experienced relative ecstasy at times, right? Just by picking out a single drum or a single cymbal, and following that throughout the track. some unexpected joy has come from that. So I really appreciate that suggestion.
Absolutely. Thank you. I will have at some point in time, if I ever publish a book, I will call the publicist and have them reach out to you for a testimonial.
Okay.
Testimonial.
My
You're
pleasure to do so.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. It's really interesting. So that's one of the things that I love about actually experimenting and exploring with music, with that of everyday samadhi at home, is just that. Is that at some point in time, I'm noticing what it evokes, and me tracking the instrument or the voice, what that does. And then even once the music's gone, right, there is this sense, this ecstasy, this bliss that's there, this openness, this spaciousness that's there. And at times I've taken that, and I don't even have to at that point do the phrases. It's just the feeling is there, and you're like, this is mettā, and you sit in that. And you relax in that, and you just allow it to be there. So,
can I ask a quick follow up on that?
Yes.
How is that mettā?
How is that the feeling? So, if I'm feeling what I'm experiencing at times will be a joy, and there's a little bit of a deeper joy, contentment, this really warm feeling that I have. And the reason I say it's mettā is because it's not exactly the same. It's quite similar to a feeling or sensation that at times comes up if I am chanting the Karaniya Metta Sutta or offering metta phrases. Quite similar. So what I do when that is there with the music, I do the same thing that I would do when I'm more or less doing metta as a concentration practice. So I'm letting those phrases go. I'm letting everything else go. And I'm just resting in that warmth, resting in that feeling that's there. Sometimes I just rest in it, sometimes I allow it to fill myself, and then there's the radiating mettā. Sometimes it's naturally at some point just radiating in all directions. I will oftentimes hear people say, oh, do you do radiating mettā? And I'm like, I don't do anything. Sometimes there's the feeling that's there, and the radiating happens. Yeah, it happens from there. And sometimes, it's good oftentimes to not even label it or try to figure out what it is, because it ends up cutting through just the joy and happiness is there. It's just, let's just be happy and joyful with this that's right there right now. So I oftentimes do that because I've noticed my tendency of like, oh, is this joy? Is this joy? Is this like, oh, it's this access constant. Like I start to try to figure out what everything is. And in terms of any deeper states of concentration, for sure, when I can get out of my own way and not try to figure out where I am, the further along and the deeper I seem to go, if I can just move out of the way. And I try to reflect on it well after the fact, not while it's going on, and not immediately after. I want to just allow the space there. So if the joy's there, let it be joy.
So actually I have a quick question and another question. So Dhammaruwan, is he the one that was like chanting when he was 3 years old or something in some ancient language that nobody had taught him, that his parents?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's a fascinating story. There's a great chapter in Analayo's book, Rebirth book. There's a great chapter, but you can actually find information about him online, the video, or there's the audio of him recording or chanting as a child is on YouTube. It's really scratchy and everything, but
But it's amazing.
Yeah, it is absolutely amazing.
Okay, so my question was, I appreciated what you said about, the judging mind, and that is a very common default mode for me. I hate to admit it because nobody likes to be judged, but the person I judge the most is me, and I think the judging of other people kind of stems from that.
Yeah.
And mettā has always been a nice antidote to that. for me as well. But you said something about, every day we have a choice or something to that effect. And I often don't feel like, sometimes the thought occurs to me and it's just like, F that, I don't even feel like I can summon that up. But there's more often than that, it just doesn't even occur to me. Like it's not a choice if it doesn't occur to me, or if it's not, if it doesn't become accessible. So I guess my question is, just from doing it repeatedly, whether it feels genuine or not, is that what makes it more likely to become accessible, or for me to remember? Or do you just write it on your hand?
Both, but both and. I think it is more likely to become habit if it is there. It's one of those things where I'm listening to the Dhamma Ruan and other metta chants and metta talks and reading any and everything about it, and it still doesn't mean, right? There are those times in this mind where I'm just like, ugh, ugh, like it's just syrupy and sickening. That's there. But what's different now is that the harsh judgment isn't there. Those thoughts come, and sometimes words, sometimes they're even actually said out loud. But there's a little bit of pause of taking a look at that. And I realized just how old that story is. This is just, it's old. It actually doesn't have any sway anymore. It's on repeat. It's there, So I allow it to be there. And it feels like the more that I just allow it to be there, the more I can get away from this idea that Devin is aversive. Devin is judgmental. I realize that identity isn't as solid, And I've moved, and it's in a sense I've moved and progressed. I'm not aversive. I'm greedy. I'm not aversive. I'm just greedy. So I've moved on to the greedy mind now. So some of that is there, but it really is. Little by little, you are going to forget, and some of the hardest things to really uproot and work with is that the judgmental mind, the perfectionist mind, and we really get on ourselves because and I love that you said that I'm most judgmental about me, and in the past have always been most judgmental about me. It comes out to other people for sure, but the root of it is right here. And that's one I think I'll be working with that till the day I die. But I've seen improvement, right? I've seen some improvement. I've seen some deepening of my practice. And just the gentleness of like, yeah, that's, sometimes in my mind is there. That's who I am. And every now and then that doesn't work. Part of it's mom and dad's fault also. I let them take some of the blame. Really, I do.
Yeah, we come by it honestly, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And actually, even it's really interesting, even thinking about it, and I look back and just the life my parents had. They're Midwesterners. I grew up in Kansas. My grandparents had a farm until the 70s. Grew up in a very particular lifestyle, and I have a great deal of compassion and love for them now that I didn't have all through my 20s, 30s, and 40s for sure. Just sort of looking back at, for the most part, we're all really trying to do the best we can. We're really trying to do the best we can, and I kind of reflect on that place, and it's really interesting because that ends up being actually quite the spark for me of metta, realizing a lot of the stories I had, the folks in those situations may have been misguided about something, or really up against their own fears and anxiety. They were doing the best they can, really. I do try to come back to that. And trying to make it out of, I do try to make it out of every day. this is being able to verbalize one thing that I was truly grateful for. And sometimes it's a tiny thing, and I'm not putting a box on what I really think that thing is supposed to be. Sometimes it's just, I'm just grateful for the crisp air. I'm grateful for the garden. I'm grateful for a conversation that I had with somebody. I'll just choose one thing and reflect on that just for a few minutes. Try not to make a big deal about it, just to really, just spending 30, 45 seconds reflecting on it. I had it a few weeks back at the airport of meeting somebody at the airport who was coming into San Francisco, and he was coming to see his daughter, and he hadn't seen his daughter in 22 years. And I could feel it. I could see it in his eyes and feel it. And it's just a lot of gratitude. I have this sense of mettā for this person I never met before. We are complete. If physically we couldn't have been any more different, our ages are different, our back, everything about us is completely different, but we related to each other on this really simple level of both having daughters. And we had a little conversation about the birth of our daughters, a quick 5-minute conversation. I reflected on that, and it's actually quite lovely. I think we'll take a question from Rajesh.
Yeah, thank you. That was an interesting talk. But I have a question which is perhaps very different than what everybody else has been asking, and perhaps somewhat contrary to some of the comments. So you talk about the change that occurs within you, and people have talked about you forget the practice, and I guess the question I have is, perhaps it can go beyond forgetfulness. Perhaps there can be a resistance within to the practice. And that perhaps, and I don't know if this makes sense to you, the change and what you talked about, the loss of identity, could that cause fear, which in fact gets in the way of the practice? Whether it could be fear, which is you may not even realize it is there, or perhaps it is fear that you realize is there because the changes that are occurring are because of the loss of habit, the loss of identity that is occurring. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one time I heard it referred to, Joseph referred to, maybe it was Carol referred to it as this loyalty to suffering. Sometimes we want to be loyal to our suffering. So yeah, it could be a lot of resistance. Absolutely. I think my initial resistance to practice, my initial resistance to mettā was really loss of identity. I am in this body that I'm in, this incarnation that I'm in. I am supposed to be fighting for justice. I am supposed to be all of these things that I was supposed to be in this identity, who I was supposed to be as a man, all of this. And then I found myself, sitting in a heap in the middle of the meditation hall in tears, shedding everything at some point. And that's where it's like, it all began to open up for that. I think I was holding on. I was afraid that I was going to be soft. I was afraid that I was no longer right. And I'm just speaking of me, my experience. I was afraid I was no longer to be fighting for justice. I was afraid of all of these things, of who I thought I was. And I think in finding the practice and in finding mettā in particular, I actually got closer to the sense of who I actually am, a part of everything else. That identity was just me separate, and I've learned and nothing really gets, like the personality stuff doesn't get shed for quite a while, right? You keep the personality. I'm sure people have seen that, right? You go on retreat for 10 days or 6 weeks or 3 months. I love that young folks will go on retreat and they're there for 3 months and they're just completely changed, and everything's going to be different now. And then they show up at their parents' house and they open the door and they find that somebody forgot to tell the 25 years of family dynamic that you just did 3 months of retreat. Right. That's all still there. It's all still there. And I think oftentimes we are afraid, or that there's fear, and sometimes with good reason, sometimes with good reason as well. And it's, again, little by little and breath by breath. It takes a while. My process of even sitting in the room to do any mettā at all, this is like 4 or 5 years before I even remotely touched it. And ultimately, some of that was about, I knew that there were these categories, and that there were the category of the difficult person. My mind went there every time. It didn't matter what category we were doing. I went to these 1 or 2 particular people that had been incredibly difficult in my life. And I was holding an identity that they harmed me, that they traumatized me. And I was holding an identity of and again, I'm just speaking of myself, just holding an identity of being victimized, of being a victim. And it was like I wanted to keep that story, to keep that going. Because if I could keep that going, that was my fire. It's got me driving. So there's some of that. And I'm glad you said that. Oftentimes, yeah, you know how many times I actually will give a talk or instructions on mettā, and everyone says, I got it, I'm good. Like, I don't believe that for a second. As much as I hated mettā, I'm like, there's got to be somebody out there that has some resistance who doesn't like this. You're kidding me, right? It's 100 people in the room, and everybody says this is wonderful. And it's a purification practice too, right? So we know this from the suttas that mettā itself serves as a purification practice. So all of those phrases and all these things, all of this intention and aspiration, may we be well, or another. Oftentimes, quite the opposite comes up, right? The gunk comes up. And that can be there. And that's the thing that scares a lot of people I've seen, in retreat setting, is that they get a little taste of mettā and they're looking around, and some people are talking about the bliss that they're feeling and all these wonderful feelings. And they just have, walked on the hot coals in hell. They're sweating and they're crying, and anger comes up and all of that. So then they back away from it. Thank you. We have the Diana, do I see? Oh, glasses.
Yeah, thank you,
Diana,
Devin.
yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, and also for all your thoughtful answers right now in the Q&A. It seems that we've covered actually quite a few topics that are woven together. And I find it interesting, this idea of fear as well, because I think for me, when I got glimpses of no self and emptiness, it is fearful, it is frightening, and it is a porousness of the self that we tend to hold on to. And when I learned that there were these divine abodes, just the name itself was like, oh, someplace to abide. I loved that you and Alan chanted the sutta, because when I heard that, it's like, oh, there's a spot. And I don't always get that, but I do think, to me, those are antidotes to what can be felt as cold, cold and empty, and a dissolution of something that we hold dear, even though it doesn't always serve us. So I don't know that I have a question in there, but I wanted to mention that and see if you had any comments related to that.
Thank you. It's a beautiful insight. That's great insight. There doesn't need to be a question. That's the great insight. That those divine abodes, the four Brahma Viharas, can serve as that base, juxtaposed to the no self experience, juxtapose this to this idea of what if we look at ourselves, you spend some time in practice and have that an experience like the no self experience, or come to this place of understanding that it's not Diana there, but this continuous flow of dynamic processes that are happening.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
want to start thinking of yourself like that, then right, then there can be some some fear that's there. But if it is all held, if it is framed and it is bookended, and if there is a refuge to go to, this refuge of belonging, which are these divine abodes, then that's where we live and that's where we rest. And we get to see ourselves reflected in others and in other beings and in the natural world. And we realize that this hard sense of ourselves here, dissolves at times and seems quite solid at other times. But one thing to always have in our back pocket are these divine abodes. That's where you go to, right? It's skillful means to like head that direction. Which is why, for me, holding something like the Mettā Sutta, like Alan was chanting, or the Anapanasati Sutta, something that I hold to memory, a gratitude practice on a day-to-day basis. I hang my hat on those things of the heart, those places of the heart. You can hang my hat on that.
yeah. During the early part of the pandemic, I sat an online retreat, and Jeannie Corrigan was one of the teachers there, and every night she would hold the final sit at 9 p.m. and she would, at the end of it, she would chant just the names of the four divine abodes, Mettā, Karuna, Upeka, just over and over again. And so that to me is a simplified version.
Yeah.
Just to chant that.
Absolutely. That is one to do. It's like, yeah, I mean, and that's one that oftentimes I know a number of people that actually have that recorded into their phones. They're listening to it themselves, either themselves or someone else doing it. It's really just chanting those names. I was told a few years back, working with a woman who had 4 children. There were 4 young children at home, all under the age of 10. And she was wanting to practice, and of course she couldn't get away to go to retreat or anything. And we sent her all of these children's clothing. We sent her these t-shirts, and all of the t-shirts had the names of the divine abodes on. So in the midst of this chaos in her house, you have all these children running around with like Karuna and Mettā and things. And she said it just made her laugh that sometimes she'd do laundry and there was every now and then she made all the children wear these shirts, which they would wear. They had these really cool designs and things otherwise, but she got to see these reminders constantly of these divine abodes of these little kids. And it is a good place. The Sure Heart's release that I was reading is another good reminder that that's, why we are practicing. Sometimes we will get in that place of just, I'm dissolving. It's all dissolving. It's all empty. What does it matter anymore? When we're come back to center, come back to balance, are these divine abodes. We can touch and see everything else and have the insight for those things and deepen into great wisdom from seeing and touching and having all of those experiences, knowing that it's all held and housed in these divine abodes. It's not just like cold out in the middle of nowhere, nothing there. It's just, and oftentimes we're seeing with our readers versus the James Webb Telescope, right? That's really what we're looking at in meditation, right? JWST. Well, it's been lovely to be with you all, and I look forward to another time. And I also know I shouldn't have a cappuccino around 3. It's not a good idea. But here we are. It's lovely to be with you all. And again, with anything that I've said, or you need would like to follow up or have another question or anything at all, you can always send me an email. And sometimes it takes a while to respond, particularly around the holidays, but I will respond. So oftentimes there's a question or people want to follow up with something, then please, you can find it through my my website. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.